The first thing my husband said in that courtroom was loud enough for every single person on that bench to hear it. Your Honor, she is nothing but a worthless Marine who forgot how to be a wife. I did not flinch. I had spent 22 years training my body not to flinch, but I will tell you honestly, those words landed somewhere no bullet ever reached. The room went completely silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment. I looked across the table at Gary, the man I had married in a small chapel in Oceanside, California, back when we were both 24 years old and certain the whole world belonged to us. He would not meet my eyes. Then I turned toward the bench because something in the judge's posture had changed. He had been reviewing paperwork when Gary spoke, and now his pen was frozen above the page. I said his name quietly. Judge Bradshaw. His head snapped up. For a long moment he simply stared at me, and I watched the color drain slowly from his face. Then he pushed his chair back so fast it nearly toppled, and he stood, right there in the middle of a divorce hearing, and said, Gunnery Sergeant Hartley, my husband's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Cobb, looked between the two of us with growing confusion. He had spent the last half hour describing me as emotionally distant, unstable, a woman who had chosen the Marine Corps over her own family. Up until that second, he had been quite pleased with himself. Now his confidence looked like it was leaking out through the bottom of his shoes. Judge Thomas Bradshaw stood there staring at me like a man seeing a ghost walk back into his life, and in a way, that is exactly what happened because the woman sitting in that courtroom was not the same 26-year-old sergeant who had carried him out of a burning hillside outside of Ramona 19 years earlier. That woman had 2 working knees. That woman still believed love was simple. That woman had no idea how much silence a marriage could hold before it finally broke apart. The bailiff cleared his throat. Your Honor. Judge Bradshaw blinked hard, sat back down slowly, and said we would be taking a recess. Gary looked confused. Cobb looked panicked, and I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap, feeling every one of my 48 years settle heavy into my spine. That was the moment my husband realized he did not actually know the woman he had spent 19 years married to. But to understand how we got to that courtroom, I need to go back to the beginning. I grew up in a small town outside of Amarillo, Texas, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a diner and a father who left before I turned 6. I was 17 when I walked into a recruiting office, mostly because I wanted something bigger than the 4 walls I had grown up inside. My mother cried when I told her, not because she was proud, at least not yet, but because she was terrified. I served 22 years in the United States Marine Corps. I deployed 3 times. I earned rank most women in my era never reached, and I learned early that carrying weight quietly was simply part of the job. Nobody teaches you how to turn that off once you come home. I met Gary in 2004 at a barbecue thrown by a mutual friend near Camp Pendleton. He was not military. He sold insurance, and he had this easy laugh that made me feel like maybe life could be soft sometimes, not just something you survived. He used to say he loved that I was strong, that I was different from every other woman he had dated. In the beginning, that felt like the greatest compliment a man could give me. We married within a year. We built a life in a small house near Fallbrook, raised our son Kevin in that same house, and for a long stretch of years, things were good. Not perfect, but good. Sunday dinners, little league games, Gary teaching Kevin how to ride a bike in the driveway while I stood on the porch pretending my chest was not tight with worry every time a car backfired somewhere down the street. But service changes a person slowly, in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who has never lived it. After I retired, the nightmares got louder, not quieter. Crowded parking lots made my hands sweat. 4th of July fireworks turned my stomach into something twisted and cold. Gary tried to understand at first. I will give him that. But as the years passed, his patience wore thin in ways he never said out loud, only showed through small comments, through sighs, through the way he introduced me at his company parties as my wife, the veteran. Like it was a strange fact about me rather than the truest part of who I was. He started spending more time with coworkers, people from a world where nobody flinched at sudden noises, people whose biggest hardship was a late flight or a missed happy hour. I think somewhere along the way he grew embarrassed of me. An old gunnery sergeant who kept her hair high and tight out of habit and still made her bed with hospital corners every single morning. Last spring, over coffee, he told me he wanted a divorce. He said I had built a wall around myself that he could not climb anymore. I remember nodding slowly, because honestly, I did not know what else to do. You can survive an ambush more easily than certain conversations at your own kitchen table. Still, I did not fight him on much. I let him keep the boat. I agreed to a fair split of our savings. I never once raised my voice. But somewhere along the way, kindness started looking like weakness to people who had stopped respecting me. And that is exactly how we ended up sitting across from each other in that courtroom, with his attorney trying to convince a judge that my service had broken me beyond repair. When the recess was called, whispers spread through the gallery almost instantly. Gary turned toward me, his expression somewhere between confusion and worry. "What was that about?" he asked. "Old memories," I told him simply. Cobb leaned forward from his side of the table. "Ma'am, do you personally know Judge Bradshaw?" "Not well," I answered, which was technically true, because you do not really know a man whose life once depended entirely on the strength left in your arms during the worst night of both your lives. You simply remember him forever. A few minutes later, the courtroom doors opened again, and Judge Bradshaw walked back in. Older than the young prosecutor I remembered, gray now threading through his hair, moving with the same careful stiffness Gary's own knees carried after football injuries decades old. Life catches up with all of us eventually. But when his eyes found mine again, I saw the same terrified young man from that hillside outside Ramona staring back at me through nearly 2 decades of years. And in that instant, I understood something important. This divorce was no longer only about property or resentment. It was going to become a conversation about the truth. Judge Bradshaw asked for a brief private meeting in his chambers before continuing. Cobb immediately objected. The judge told him calmly that he could object all he liked, but the meeting would still happen. I followed a bailiff down a quiet hallway lined with old portraits of retired judges, the whole building smelling faintly of paper and burnt coffee. His chambers were smaller than I expected, filled with law books, family photographs, and a small wooden model of a lighthouse sitting near the window. The moment the door shut behind us, he simply stared at me, shaking his head slowly. "I cannot believe this," he said quietly. Neither could I for a moment. 19 years disappeared between us like smoke off a hillside. "You look tired, Gunny," he finally said, and I laughed softly. "That makes 2 of us, sir." Then he walked around his desk and hugged me, not the polite kind of hug people give at reunions, but the real kind, the kind that carries years of unspoken gratitude inside it. "You saved my life," he said. "Long time ago," I answered. "Not to me," he said, sitting back down slowly, still studying my face like he could not quite believe I was real. "I looked for you afterward," he admitted. "For years, actually. That surprised me. You disappeared after that fire season," he continued. I told him about the deployments that followed, about the transfers, about how life simply kept happening the way it does until decades pass without you noticing. He nodded slowly. "Life happened," he repeated. "That phrase carries different weight once you pass 45. He leaned back and asked if I remembered that night. Of course I did. September of 2005, the wildfire season that tore through the hills outside Ramona faster than anyone predicted, turning evacuation routes into dead ends within a single hour. I had been running emergency support alongside a small Marine unit assisting local fire crews when reports came in of a young reporter and a county attorney trapped near a collapsed access road, flames closing in from 2 directions. That reporter was Thomas Bradshaw, 27 years old at the time, ambitious, sharp, and utterly terrified. By the time my team reached him, smoke had swallowed most of the visibility, and the heat had already begun blistering the paint on nearby vehicles. I pulled him from an overturned car myself, half carrying him nearly a quarter-mile downhill toward a clearing before an evacuation truck reached us. I tore ligaments in my knee that night that never fully healed. To this day, cold mornings still remind me of that hillside. Back in his chambers, Bradshaw opened a drawer and carefully removed something wrapped in cloth. Inside was my old Marine Corps coin, the one I had pressed into his palm inside the ambulance that night, the one I told him to keep as a reminder that surviving something means you owe the world a little more afterward. I had not seen that coin in 19 years. "You gave me this," he said, and told me exactly that. It changed the direction of my whole life. Over the years, I had noticed his name occasionally in local papers, assistant prosecutor, eventually a respected judge with a spotless reputation, something that felt almost impossible in this line of work. He leaned forward and asked quietly what had happened to me. I could have answered a dozen different ways. Deployments happened, time happened, Silence happened. Instead, I simply said, I got tired, and he understood immediately. The way people from difficult backgrounds always seem to understand each other without needing every detail explained. Then he asked if I had ever threatened or harmed my husband in any way, and I told him no, without hesitation. He nodded once, already certain of the answer, before he asked. Your husband's attorney is attempting to portray your service as a liability rather than a strength, he told me. That did not surprise me one bit. Are you angry? He asked. I thought about Gary sitting outside that door, the man who used to slow dance with me barefoot in our kitchen during our first year of marriage, the same man who now looked at me like I was something to apologize for at dinner parties. No, I told him honestly. Mostly, I am just tired of being underestimated. Then Bradshaw opened a folder sitting on his desk, and inside were letters, dozens of them, gathered over years from Marines I had once served alongside, men and women whose names I still remembered clearly. One letter came from a young corporal I had once talked out of a very dark moment during a deployment overseas. Another came from a widow whose mortgage I had quietly helped cover for several months after her husband passed. People do not forget women like you, Gunny, Bradshaw told me. For a moment, I could not speak. Because after enough years pass, you genuinely start believing the world has simply moved on without remembering you at all. When we walked back into the courtroom together, the entire room fell into a different kind of silence, the kind that spreads when people sense something significant happen behind closed doors, even without knowing what. Gary looked nervous for the first time since the proceedings began. Cobb attempted another angle almost immediately, asking whether my years of service had left me emotionally unavailable and incapable of participating fully in a healthy marriage. That is a fair question, I answered calmly, and I carry damage, yes, but damage is not the same thing as incapacity. The courtroom stayed quiet. I still love the life I built with my family every single day, I continued, and that hit harder than I expected it to. Gary's eyes filled instantly. Cobb tried recovering his footing, arguing that love without communication eventually becomes neglect, and honestly, he was not entirely wrong, which was the hardest part of hearing it out loud. Then something shifted that I never expected. Gary spoke up on his own. That is enough, he said quietly, silencing the room completely. He looked at me, then at the judge, and admitted that he had spent years comparing our marriage to friends whose spouses worked ordinary jobs with ordinary schedules and ordinary nightmares, and somewhere along the way, he had simply stopped trying to understand what I carried instead of asking about it. She never once raised a hand to me or to our son, he said. She just stopped letting people see how much pain she carried quietly, and eventually, I stopped trying to see it either. The final ruling came 2 weeks later, fair and without unnecessary cruelty. Gary kept the boat. I kept the house near Fallbrook, along with a peace I had not felt inside those walls in years. I began volunteering at a veterans support center outside of Oceanside, helping other former service members navigate paperwork, medical claims, and the quiet, complicated process of learning how to exist in civilian life again. Months later, our son Kevin invited both of us to his daughter's school assembly for Veterans Day. I almost declined. Crowds still exhaust me more than people realize, but my granddaughter Sophie begged until I agreed. Gary showed up too, and we sat several rows apart at first, awkward in the way people are after everything falls apart and slowly starts rebuilding into something smaller but steadier. Judge Bradshaw walked onto that small gymnasium stage as the surprise guest speaker, and near the end of his remarks, he asked me to stand in front of the entire room. I wanted to disappear into the folding chair beneath me, but Sophie squeezed my hand and would not let go. The applause that followed was not loud or dramatic, just steady, the kind reserved for people who spent most of their lives believing nobody was paying attention. Afterward, Sophie slipped her small hand into mine and whispered that everybody liked me. I told her not to trust a crowd too quickly, and she laughed the way only children can. That evening, Gary showed up at my door carrying a small wooden box. Inside was a folded flag from my retirement ceremony that I thought I had lost years earlier during one of our moves. Neither of us said much at first. Then he told me he was sorry for forgetting how much strength it takes to carry silence for so many years. I told him I was sorry too for never teaching him how to ask the right questions. We are not back together, and I doubt we ever will be. But something quieter and steadier grew between us instead, something that finally looks like respect. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, a veteran, a spouse, a parent, or simply a quiet person carrying weight nobody else can see. Take a moment today to tell them they matter, because sometimes the people holding everything together the longest are the very ones the world forgets to notice.